my passion manifested itself when I was in law school, quite truthfully, as I watched situations that happened with respect to people that weren't white. And it was just, in my mind, an unfair procedure, and I didn't care for that type of thing. That I decided to run for alderman. I was an assistant city attorney for 4 years, and I had been appointed by Raymond Tellez, who ultimately became the ambassador to Costa Rica. President Kennedy appointed him. Marvelous man. And he hired me as an assistant city attorney, and I worked with city councils, I worked with city plan commissions, I worked with zoning boards of adjustment, I worked with the Civil Service Commission, advising them as to how what the law was with respect to any questions that might bubble up. And it worked out that I became very interested in the city and what could be done and how we could build this city and how we could help some of the people that were living here that weren't being helped quite. They elected Raymond Tellez, the first American of Mexican descent that was elected, and that was the beginning of the change. See, and he appointed me because I worked in his campaign, and being a Spanish speaker and having been raised on the South Side, I had an impact with a lot of not only athletes but people that lived there that knew me and had known me, and so consequently he felt that I should be an assistant city attorney. But then the point that you were making about civil rights, that as it had occurred to me time and again as I watched President Kennedy fighting for civil rights and speaking and trying to do the best he could, but having a hard time in Texas and throughout the South, I took it upon myself, based upon certain incidents that occurred, to draft an ordinance, which is a law, and ultimately we passed it banning discrimination in motels, hotels, theaters, and restaurants. Now, that mostly had an impact probably on Americans of African descent, more so than the Mexican-American people, but it did affect Mexican-American people because they were being stepped on also. And that offended me because I grew up and lived with Mexican people all of my life. All of my early life, let's put it that way, and even to this very day, by the way. And it was just something that I felt was necessary, and that was in 1962. I was elected in 61. By 62, I'd gotten the ordinance ready, and I had an incident with one of the finest athletes and gentlemen that ever walked the streets of El Paso, Nolan Richardson, who has schools named after him now, who has won so many laurels that I could never ever begin to even list them. He's in every Hall of Fame that you can possibly have. He's won National Junior College Championships. He won the NIT National Invitational Tournament when he was at Tulsa University, and he also won the NCAAs. He was a young boy, and about 19 or 20, he really hadn't found himself after he got out of Bowie High School. Mm-hmm. But I had been associated with his coach there, Nemo Herrera, who was turned out to be one of the great coaches too of all times. And Nolan was a baseball player, and I was a softball player, and so I had kind of recruited him to come on and play with us. And as it happened, he came out one evening, and we played at Memorial Park, which is out on Copia Street, as you know. And on our way home, I told him I wanted to stop and have a beer, and I was tired, and I was a little older, and so we stopped in. And, Bert, I can't go in there. You understand, he's a black American. And I said, Nolan, you're going in there with me. Let's go. We're going to go in there, and I've got to, yeah, I'm going to have something right now. You get a Coke or something. He said, okay. So he went in, and the waitress came in, and she didn't even look at him, refused to almost look at him. And she told me, what would you like? And I said, well, I'd like this, and I'd like it. And she said, I cannot serve him. Right to my face. And here I'm a city alderman. And so I said, well, ma'am, I said, don't you understand that the times are changing? This is going to be a better world, irrespective of what you say or what anybody else says here or what your owner says, or something of that nature. I've forgotten exactly what the talk was, but as it turned out, she refused to serve him, and so I told her that I'd be back. And so that's when I got in my office the next day, and the following few days, put the ordinance together, drafted it the way we wanted it, and submitted to the city council. And I'd already talked to all 4 aldermen. In those days, we only had 4 city council members besides the mayor, and they all were in agreement. And I was a little worried about one of them particularly, because he was a very good friend of the mayor's, and the mayor had expressed feelings of not wanting to get involved in civil rights, and our city shouldn't do that, and things of that nature that were silly. And we went on and passed the ordinance, and then he vetoed it, and we had to wait the necessary, it was 2 weeks, which is set out in the city charter. And we had almost 3. We had to move city council chambers into a big hall that we had that held approximately, called Liberty Hall, which you don't know anything about, but it was in the old building, the old courthouse, and we had about 3,000 people there to see whether we overrode that ordinance. And as it turned out, everybody went along with it, and we overrode the ordinance, we overrode the mayor's veto, and it became law. And it was the beginning of everything, because cities from all over the South, there were several of them, San Antonio, things that those that have a high minority population were calling us, asking us to send copies of the ordinance, and which we I was alderman. I had made a point with one of the aldermen to let's go out and see a Sarco. I was very unhappy about the way lead, cadmium, and zinc, and all these different things were being dropped on our city, and the city of Juarez also. That was when I was alderman. I was still, we'd already had the civil rights thing, but I wanted to get into this, into being doing something about a Sarco, because it really was beginning to be right into the middle of the city. And it was 2 major cities, and for them to spew out all that poison was more than I could stand. But I didn't do anything about it then, because I wasn't, well, there was so many different things that came up that created a problem for me with respect to pushing anything at that time. But ultimately I became mayor, and when I became mayor of the city, I had a little bit more power, and I was in a position to tell the city attorneys to draw up a petition, and I was a lawyer, of course, and we're going to sue a Sarco and tell them, make them clean up their air. And so that was in June of, I think it was in June, I'm not sure. No, it was in March or April of '72. And it was a big item in the press and people and all over that somebody finally sued him. You're going to cost us all these jobs, and it's going to it's going to hurt our business, it's hurting our business in the community. Everybody was uptight with me, and they didn't much, a lot of those type of people didn't much like me anyway, because I was a liberal human being that felt that these things had to be done. And so the council went along with me. Thank goodness I had a great city council that did it, and the lawsuit progressed to trial, and we got a large judgment against the Sarco, and they had to clean up their act completely. We had all sorts of equipment that they had to repurchase and buy. All the employees were instructed to order masks in certain areas of the circle.
Mm-hmm.
Because we brought in the best doctors you could possibly bring in. Brought them in from Northwestern University, from Johns Hopkins, brought in the best pediatricians to see what impact and to have testimony as to what impact all these different chemicals were having on the people of El Paso,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the children. And so we won the lawsuit. First city to really take on a major mining smelting facility with respect to clean air. Now, I want you to imagine that was 1972, so you're talking about 35 years ago. And even then, it created a bit of obstinacy in some of the people because they didn't want to take on business. Well, some businesses need to be taken on. And that one did. And now we've, with Senator Shapley's great work, and he has been marvelous with it. And he's led the fight here these last years since he's been in the Senate, and it's just been finally now I think it's closed, but you never know. Money talks, and it's owned by Grupo de México y tienen más dinero que todos. So we have to be very careful about it and why.
As a lifelong El Pasoan and someone say, if you're going to give advice on leadership or just ganas for, I guess, the next generation of leaders, what advice would you give to them?
You talk about my speaking to young people?
Mm-hmm.
I've been fortunate enough to speak to the college in many different, of their classes and different people up there.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of fun doing it, by the way. Expressing what has to be done. And we need young leaders. And we need people that aren't afraid to speak out, even when the cause is not popular. The important thing is whether it's right or not. And if it's right, don't be afraid to speak out. Just make sure that you're prepared to speak well. Say the right things, and the only thing that will come from that is all you'll do is progress individually in the city and the state or county, wherever it may be. All of them will benefit from it. It's a great life. Si no tienes miedo, you got a shot at it. But you've got to be forceful. You've got to not be afraid, and speak reasonably. And in that sense, you'll ultimately prevail. much better. You mentioned Smeltertown. That was one of the more difficult things that I had to do.
Mm-hmm.
I had to help, I had to convince 750 families. And you have some relatives, of course,
Mm-hmm.
that live there, to move. Now, they'd been there for years and years and years and had their jobs as a Sarco, so many of them.
Mm-hmm.
But the place was
Contaminated.
completely contaminated.
Yeah.
Ahí estaban los niños
Mm-hmm.
jugando en la tierra, and it was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And we made vast, good studies and great doctors. So I had to spend several hours at the school one night. They came, packed. Everybody from Smeltertown was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat on a table there and I explained to them over a period of 5 hours in Spanish as to how important it was that their children not have the problems that they've had with respect to living and playing the way they were playing.
Mm-hmm.
If we finally put them all in public housing, moved out, and nobody lives there anymore.
Great.
I had to even close down a little small church, a little small Catholic church, and I'm a Catholic, so that hurt me. But the priest came up to me afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
¿Y sabes lo que me dijo?
Okay.
He said, Mr. Mayor, he said, you have a star in heaven.